What I think is one of the most underrated difficulties on the bassoon is downward slurs, meaning starting on a certain note and then slurring down to a note below it. Usually when it's a bigger leap, it's much more difficult. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how to make sure that that low note is going to speak and how to get better in general at downward slurs. If this is the first time we're meeting, my name is Dr. Natalie Law, and I'm a professional bassoonist and teacher, and I love to help students just like you get better at playing the bassoon. So if you aren't already, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and stick around for more tips, tools, and strategies for improving your playing at the bassoon. So you've probably encountered this problem before, that when you're slurring from a note down to a lower note, especially if it's a wide leap, that lower note sometimes doesn't want to speak. If you're anything like me, you sometimes might think, oh my gosh, is this note going to speak? Is it going to work? Oh my gosh, oh, here it is. And having that mentality is so not helpful. So one reason that downward slurs are so difficult on the bassoon is because at a very basic level, often you are moving from pushing air through a certain part of the instrument, and then when you go to a lower note, you're having to push air through more of the instrument. And so there's an initial resistance to that lower note that you don't generally feel if you're going in the upper direction. It's always easier generally to slur up than it is to slur down, because usually we're having to push more air through the instrument, and especially if you have to do that second note at a diminuendo or you're at a soft dynamic to begin with, you don't ever want that note to just stick out at the end of a phrase. So there are just a couple small tips that I have to fix this, and one note is with your air. Typically, it's that mentality that, oh my gosh, the note's not going to speak. Is it going to work? Oh my gosh, I'm exposed. And when we start having those thoughts, our air tends to go too. We tend to wimp out on our air, and we're thinking, oh, is it going to work? And then we clench up and tense up, and then the air just dies and the note doesn't speak. And so you have to think about pushing your air all the way through the end of the note. And especially if you're going through a passage where there's lots of leaps, your air has to be able to navigate all of those leaps. So for example, in the very beginning of the Hindemith Bassoon Sonata, which by the way is a beautiful piece, if you aren't already familiar with it, I'll link down to where you can purchase it below. This is a great piece to play, but it's the first movement is full of all of these downward slurs that make it a little bit tricky to play at first. Even in just the first couple measures, we have a E flat, D down to a G slur, and that G sometimes is a little scary to play at the end of that slur. Sometimes it sounds like this, where the G doesn't want to speak, and we want it to instead to sound like. And that particular note is helpful because it is on a crescendo, so you don't have to come away as much. A few measures later, you have F sharp to G, and then E to F sharp, and that's tricky. The E to F sharp in particular, the F sharp tends to stick out or not speak at all. We don't want that F sharp to speak out, but we need to start with the end in mind. So we need to start that and first F sharp thinking about that last F sharp. So start with the end in mind so that your air can navigate all of those leaps. And you're still going to be making slight adjustments in your voicing. You're going to be opening up a little bit more in the back of your throat to be able to accommodate that. But it's more about your air being able to navigate. So don't wimp out on your air and start with the end in mind. Think about where the air has to go and start knowing that you have to get there. Don't just hope that it's going to happen. You have to make sure that it does happen. Another tip that I have has to do with the embouchure. So air is leading everything. embouchure can very easily get in the way, along with often giving up on our air at the end of that slur. Our embouchure tends to tense up as well. So it's always finding that balance between keeping the embouchure open enough, but not so open that you don't have control. So more often than not, you are adjusting things in the back of your throat and with your air, but you're not going to be adjusting so much with your embouchure, unless you are doing an extreme decrescendo to a piano, in which case you need that embouchure at the very end of that piano to just do that last little taper. One particularly difficult type of downward slurs is when we're slurring down into our very low register. And everything applies for the low register as it does for the upper register. It's just with the lower register, you have to be 100% committed to it. If you're not committed to that low register speaking with your air, with your embouchure, and with your mentality, then that low note is not going to speak. I recommend especially if you're particularly struggling with low notes, to check out my low notes video, because in that video I talk about low notes in particular and things that you can do to play them better, and all of those things sort of apply to being able to play downward slurs correctly, particularly in the low register. So in that example, at the very end of that decrescendo, I'm using my embouchure just to do the tiniest little bit of cinching in. Remember, the embouchure is like a drawstring bag, and it's sort of cinching in just slightly to be able to achieve that very end of the decrescendo. But in general, you don't want to squeeze up too much. If you're not sure if your embouchure is working correctly for you, be sure to check out my embouchure video where I teach my 3-step process for creating a bassoon embouchure, and that pretty much sticks around for all of your bassoon playing. We do make adjustments to our embouchure, but maintaining that good embouchure to start is really going to be key to being successful at the downward slurs. So again, just to recap, making sure that your air doesn't die out and that your embouchure doesn't cinch up too much are two main keys in making sure that those downward slurs work. And I think the biggest thing that you can think about is it's completely mental. You know that you can do that slur, but you get in your own way when you get stressed about it, when you're performing or in a rehearsal. And so you need to just tell yourself, yes, I can play that slur. I've played even bigger slurs. That slur is not that big of a deal. And it really isn't that big of a deal. So make yourself think, oh, this is no big deal. Here it is. And just play the slur. And it's that easy. If this video was helpful for you, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And let me know down in the comments, do you ever struggle with downward slurs? And if so, what have you found to be helpful for them? Or what other questions do you have about specific downward slur scenarios that you have struggled with?